It was in the waning years of the 14th century, in the shadow of the Carpathian passes, that a man known only by the name Benedictus withdrew into the tower of St. Juris. The tower stood crooked against the sky, its stones weathered by the salt breath of time, and moss growing thick between the bricks like green memories that refused to die. Benedictus had once been a learned scribe at the court of a minor voivode, one of many forgotten lords whose banners had rotted in the wind and whose name had long since disappeared from prayer books and gravestones. In youth, Benedictus copied charters and penned homilies, his ink cold, his fingers stained with the soot of 1,000 candles. The court crumbled during the pestilence years, and those who survived scattered like dry leaves. He, however, did not flee. He ascended not in spirit, but in stone, taking sanctuary in the bell tower where pigeons kept watch. There, beneath the clanging iron mouth of the bell, he wrote. He wrote not in Latin, nor in the polished Slavonic of ecclesiastical law, but in the tongue of common men, of dying villages, of the wind that passed nameless through the birches. His ink was a mixture of soot and vinegar. His parchment, scraps of old liturgies, palimpsests scarred with vinegar and scraped clean with a bone blade. He was not mad. But he was no longer holy among the living. The villagers called him the ash monk. Though he wore no habit, his beard was grey as lichen and his voice thin as chimney smoke. Children said he talked to books, and perhaps he did. The chapel under the tower had been abandoned long before his time, its altar eaten by mice, its saints cracked and eyeless. But in the upper chamber, where the wind moaned like a widow in winter, Benedictus had made a library. Not of fine tomes or gilded missals, those had been stolen by looters decades prior. His library was made of broken things, shattered scrolls, burnt folios, torn pages wrapped in cloth and stored in wine barrels. It was said he wrote by the hour of matins, when all was most still, and sometimes by candlelight in the hour before storms. What did he write? No one truly knew. Perhaps he chronicled the slow vanishing of his world, the names of fields sold to nobles who never tilled them, the lives of peasants forgotten by their priests. Perhaps he recorded confessions no one dared speak aloud. Perhaps he simply copied the same lines again and again, until the quill split or the page ran black. But we do know this, every few weeks, he descended the tower with a handful of bread crusts or pickled beets to trade with the remaining villagers. His eyes were sunken, but kind. His body stooped, but calm. He asked for no favors, save salt. And he never spoke of the day the fire would come. The past, when abandoned, does not sleep. It lingers. It turns to mold in the corners of barns, or gets caught in the throat of old men dying in their beds. But Benedictus understood something rare, that memory is not a comfort, but a burden. That history is not a crown, but a chain. That words, once inked, can enslave as surely as iron. In his tower, the scribe had begun to fear the things he had written. Not for their content, he had not composed heresy, but for their silence. For what they preserved. For how faithfully they remembered the cruelty of men. He had written of landlords who sealed wells to starve their tenants, of girls sold in winter for a sack of rye, of a priest who blessed a war hearse but not the dying. He had recorded these things with the cold fidelity of a man who thought the truth would set someone free. But now, older, alone, he began to ask, set whom free? And from what? Some nights he woke sweating, having dreamed of pages fluttering like dead birds from the tower windows. Of ink dripping not black, but red. of footsteps on the stairs, though none had climbed them in years. The books stared at him from their shelves of stone and straw. Some he had copied himself, others rescued from collapsed abbeys. He had once believed he was saving them. Now, he wondered if they were saving him or watching him. When winter came, and it came early that year, a silence fell so complete it was like the land itself had chosen to forget. Snow lay thick upon the steeple. The villagers shuttered their doors, lit tallow lamps, whispered tales they did not understand. They no longer visited the tower. And Benedictus, in that aching stillness, began to make preparations. Not for death. No, he had made peace with that long ago. But for fire. For forgetting. For freedom, perhaps. Or something very near to it. The last week before the fire, the snow began to fall in long, unbroken lines, like the softest of pen strokes on a vast unwritten page. It muffled sound, covered memory, and swallowed even the bells, whose tongue had long since rusted. Inside the tower, Benedictus moved slowly among his shelves, wrapped in the fur-lined cloak of a forgotten bishop, the fabric moth-bitten and worn with age. He did not speak aloud, nor sing hymns as he once did. His breath was shallow now, and the bones in his hand protested each motion of the quill. Still, he continued writing. Each page he touched seemed to resist him, as if reluctant to bear the weight of yet another sorrow. But he persisted, as he always had, not for glory, nor for God, but for some lesser, quieter vow. He was writing the names. Just the names. Of the dead who had no grave. Of the living who had no name. He wrote them in lists, with care and slowness, as if engraving their breath back into the world. Some were real, shepherds who died in the plague, midwives executed for imagined heresies. Some may have never been. No matter. He wrote them all. A wind rose one night, fierce and shrill, and broke a stained glass remnant high above the apse. Shards fell into the dark like small colored stars. The firewood was nearly gone. Mice made homes in the footnotes of his older scrolls. And still, he wrote. There is a strange thing that happens to a man when he begins to live among records and relics. He forgets his own pulse. The flesh recedes. Days blur into dim rituals, the lighting of the lamp, the scratching of ink, the measured prayer before sleep. He no longer fears death, but begins instead to dread interruption. And yet, in the hour just before dawn, Benedictus would sometimes rise from his parchment and walk to the narrow stone slit of a window. He would peer out at the forest's edge, where wolves passed like grey thoughts. He would touch the cold sill with bare fingers, remembering something, a warmth, perhaps, or a woman's voice. He never wrote about those things. Some truths cannot be held in ink. The decision to burn it all did not come suddenly. It was like frost creeping into the spine of the house, silent, gradual, inevitable. He had already begun to feel the weight of too much remembering. Some documents he could no longer bear to look at, the ledger of children taken during the famine, the poem stitched in blood by a nun before her execution. The text survived. The woman did not. What good, then, had the memory done? He feared what the next eyes might see. If some noble, some bishop, some prince's steward were to stumble upon his library, what would they make of it? A collection of sedition? A record of failures? An accusation? He had spent half a lifetime gathering these ghosts. He could not bear to let them be misread. Benedictus began to stack the oldest manuscripts first. He did not burn them yet, he simply arranged them in the nave like offerings at a forgotten altar. A scroll tied with the hair of a murdered priest. A page of psalms translated into a forbidden tongue. A letter from a weaver, never sent, confessing to a crime that was only hunger. He wept once, not from sorrow, but from the sheer weight of it all. A cry that rose not from the throat, but from somewhere deeper. A sorrow that no word could ever translate. On the seventh night, he lit the candle at the center of the chapel. His hands trembled. He read aloud a passage from one of his first journals. They tell me to keep faith. But no one tells me where to place it. The church is empty. The land is sold. The saints are silent. So I keep faith in memory. I remember. Then he laid the journal upon the pyre. One by one, he placed the scrolls beside it. Not all, some he buried beneath the floorboards, out of mercy or cowardice. He was, after all, still a man. Finally, he set fire to the past. It burned quickly. Old woolen curls like autumn leaves. Ink runs like tears. Binding glue melts and hisses like a beast. The fire did not roar, it whispered. The smoke rose grey and slow, filling the chapel with the scent of age and endings, singed leather, pine resin, dust, old wax. Benedictus did not look away. He sat near the flame, cross-legged like a child at a sermon, and watched as history turned to heat. He did not think of salvation. He thought of silence. Of what it meant to free the dead from the burden of being known. Outside, snow fell. Inside, light danced on stone. And when the flame had eaten its fill, and only ash remained, Benedictus swept the floor clean. He made no prayer. He made no vow. He climbed back to his tower, where the last of the pages lay, the names, and gently laid his body down beside them. By the time the villagers saw the smoke, the snow had already buried half the chapel's roof. It did not rise like a warning, but coiled low to the ground, a pale, creeping mist, heavy with the smell of burning hair and ink. A few of the elders crossed themselves. The younger ones did not. They had long learned not to ask what happened in the tower. Some thought him dead already. Some hoped he was. But no one climbed the hill. No one approached the chapel. Perhaps it was fear. Or perhaps it was the quiet agreement all villagers share, that certain men are no longer part of the living world, and it is best to let them finish dying on their own. Inside, the fire was done. What remained was soft and grey and bitter to the tongue. A century of memory collapsed into dust. Benedictus had not spoken since. He moved slowly now, more shadow than man, and the mice no longer feared him. He did not write. He did not weep. He merely stayed. The names he had saved, those last pages, he placed inside a linen pouch and sewed shut with the last thread from his own robe. He tucked it beneath a loose stone in the wall, where the wind could not reach it, and pressed his palm against it for a long time. It was not hope. It was not belief. It was the closest thing he still possessed to prayer. There is something terrible about survival. To endure after the fire, after the forgetting, after the voices have all gone, is not a triumph. It is a haunting. Benedictus no longer feared death. What he feared was being the last to remember, the last to carry the weight of names no one would speak aloud. Every step on the cold stone floor was a reminder. Every breath, a small betrayal. He began to speak to the tower itself, not in madness, but in rhythm, like a monk might chant to a god he no longer believes in. He recited fragments, pieces of old entries, bits of psalms, not to preserve them but to exhaust them. To let the words live once more, then vanish, as all words must. You are dust, and to dust you shall return, he whispered once, not knowing if he meant the pages or himself. In time, his limbs grew stiff. He no longer descended from the bell tower. The chapel below was blackened and empty, an empty mouth, long since silenced. He remained in the small upper chamber where once he had written for hours without sleep, chasing memory like a man chases ghosts. There he waited. No one came. But he did not mind. He was not waiting for rescue, nor revelation. He was waiting for stillness, the kind that cannot be broken. He ate little. He drank snowmelt. He watched the forest sway in the wind. When he could no longer stand, he lay on the stone floor, wrapped in the cloak of the bishop, now stiff and torn. His eyes, once pale and quick, now seemed to fade into the color of ash. And then one night, or morning, no one knows, he stopped. When the villagers finally entered the chapel in spring, they found only the scent of care and silence. Children pressed their hands to the soot-covered altar, not knowing what had burned. The upper stairs were brittle with age and fear, and none climbed them. No body was ever found. Only the tower remained. Watching. Waiting. As if it, too, remembered something it wished it could forget. We do not know what truly happened to Benedictus. Perhaps he died quietly in that room, the last historian of a world no longer willing to be remembered. Perhaps the fire took more than parchment. Perhaps he faded into the dust he had once preserved. But weeks later, a mason repairing a cracked foundation found a pouch hidden in the wall. Inside, folded with care, were names. Only names. No explanations. No curses. No claims of glory. Just a list of the forgotten. What is history, if not a way of saying you were here? You mattered. And what is forgetting, if not mercy? He was called Matveye, and his boots were clean. That was the first thing the villagers noticed. Not his fine fur cloak or the thin golden ring on his gloved hand, but the boots. Black, polished, silent. No mud clung to them, though the thaw had turned the road to St. Juris into a mire of rot and last year's leaves. He came on the orders of a prince, one whose lands stretched east beyond the Dniester, where rivers gleamed like coins and law was inked in blood. Matvey was not a soldier, though he carried a knife. Nor a priest, though he bowed his head before the blackened altar. He was a clerk, and he had come for the tower. Or more precisely, for whatever remained inside it. He carried a ledger bound in wolfskin and the seal of a noble house. When he questioned the villagers, his tone was kind, but empty, like someone long accustomed to the taste of lies. What happened to the man who lived here, he asked. He burned the books, they said. Why? No one answered. Matvey walked the perimeter of the chapel. The snow had receded into muddy veins. The wind smelled of damp stone and old ash. His boots left no prints. He entered. And the silence greeted him like a host. Inside the tower, he found not a madman's hoard, nor the heretical writings his prince had feared. He found only absence. Soot-covered walls. Shelves scraped bare. A faint scorch on the flagstones. And in the corner of the scriptorium, a pile of rat-nibbled straw, and a single feather quill broken at the neck. He searched carefully, methodically. Beneath the floorboards. Behind loose bricks. He found the pouch of names only by accident, dislodging a stone with the butt of his knife. He opened it slowly. Paper. Faded but dry. Names. Only names. No titles. No dates. No signposts to guide the curious or the cruel. He read them once. Then again. His lips did not move. That night, Matvey lit no fire. He sat in the tower and listened. Not for voices or ghosts, but for what might still linger in a place like this, the last breath of an idea, maybe, or the echo of a man's final silence. He had seen burnings before. Had copied decrees that called for them, orders to destroy writings deemed corrupt, dangerous, or merely uncomfortable. He had once transcribed the execution sentence of a monk who translated scripture into the tongue of farmers. He'd even catalogued the books that were taken from libraries and sealed in crypts beneath the chancery, not burned, but buried, as if the words themselves might awaken in darkness. But this was different. There was no sentence. No tribunal. No record. Only a man who chose, alone, to let his knowledge die with him. Matvey did not report the names. He could have. He was paid too. But something in the neatness of the list, in the way the letters bent downward like grieving shoulders, it struck him with a feeling he had not known since childhood. Reverence. He returned the pouch to its hiding place. Then he left the tower, walking backwards for the first few steps, not from superstition, but from a strange, wordless respect. When he returned to court weeks later, he handed in his report. The site is ruined. Nothing survives. The prince did not ask twice. He had more pressing matters, border skirmishes, royal marriages, the cost of salt. He signed the clerk's report and moved on. And that might have been the end of it. But Matvey had copied the names. Not into his ledger, but into memory. There are men who believe that history lives in monuments, in statues and scrolls, in vaults and victories. But there are others, rarer, who know that sometimes history survives only in silence. In the heart of a man who tells no one what he has seen. In the echo of boots on stone. In a list of names that no longer belong to anyone, and yet still matter. No one knew her true name. She arrived in the spring, long after the last snows had melted from the graves, walking with a limp and carrying a bundle wrapped in a child's blanket. Her hair was bound beneath a red veil, not the bright crimson of court ladies, but a deep, earthen red, the color of dried blood and clay. Some said she was a widow. Others, a nun in exile. A few whispered darker things, that she had fled the east, where the river villages were disappearing, and where men with torches now read from books they could not understand. But she gave no explanation. She asked only one question. Where is the man who wrote the names? They directed her to the tower, though many begged her not to go. There is nothing left, said an old woman, offering a boiled egg and a place to sleep. Only ghosts. But the woman with the red veil simply nodded and continued on foot. She did not flinch as she stepped through the blackened chapel. She did not pause at the scorched altar. She climbed the tower, slowly, with a hand pressed to the stone wall for balance. She found the room as it had been left. Dust in the air like breath held too long. The broken quill. the wind slipping through the gaps like forgotten prayers. And something else. Something beneath the floorboards. It took her 3 days to find the pouch. She did not rush. She cleaned the ash first, then swept the stone with a birch broom she made herself. She lit no candle, relying on the grey light that passed through the narrow window, like time itself peering in. On the third morning, her fingers found the loose stone, and beneath it, cloth. When she unwrapped it, she wept. Not aloud. Not with great shaking sobs. But with stillness, the kind of weeping that comes when the soul recognizes something it has been waiting for. She read the names one by one. She spoke them aloud. Many were unfamiliar. But some she knew. A sister who vanished during the famine. A man who once taught letters in a barn before the soldiers came. A friend who drowned rather than betray a neighbor. The names were simple. No titles. No footnotes. But they were true. And in the speaking of them, the woman with the red veil became something she had not been in years, witness. She stayed in the tower. Did not descend for food or comfort. Villagers saw her figure pass sometimes in the upper window, a splash of red against the pale stone, like a drop of life clinging to bone. She did not rebuild the library. She did not write new words. But she added one name to the list. With trembling hand, and ink made from soot and berry wine, she added, at the end, Benedictus. Who remembered? Then folded the parchment and returned it to its hiding place. She left the tower in silence and walked into the hills. No one saw her again. Years passed. The prince died. The village became a road. The road became a ruin. The tower stood. And sometimes, only sometimes, a traveler would find it. Not marked on any map. No bell. No altar. Just stone and wind and silence. And a name. By the time the tower finally fell, no one was left to hear it. The stone collapsed inward in the dead of night, as quietly as an old man exhaling for the last time. No lightning struck it. No army came. It was not raised in rage or in glory. It simply surrendered to time, the one force that does not rage, or hunger, or forgive. When morning came, the wind passed over the ruins without changing pitch. Birds nested in the broken arch. Grass crept into the cracks like memory returning home. The world, as it always does, moved on. But somewhere in the deep corridors of a distant monastery, where nothing is ever truly thrown away, a single parchment survived. No seal. No signature. Just a list of names, written in a slow, slanted hand. It had been tucked between two volumes of forgotten theology, unnoticed for decades. The ink was faded, the corners brittle. But the words, the names, remained. And at the bottom, in smaller script, Benedictus. Who remembered? And the one who spoke the names again. A young monk found it while dusting the archives. He was not a learned man, not yet. But something in the page made him pause. He did not recognize the language at first, an old dialect, rough and local. But the form was familiar. A list. A record. A prayer. He made no note of it in the catalogue. He did not tell his abbot. But he memorized the names. What survives of a person? Not the body. That goes quickly. Not the voice. It fades faster still. Not even the written word. Parchment burns, ink fades, pages rot. But sometimes, rarely, a name endures. Spoken. Then spoken again. Passed not in books, but in breath. From mouth to mouth. From heart to heart. That is not history. It is not legacy. It is something smaller. Something harder. Something almost holy. There was never a monument for Benedictus. No statue. No shrine. Only ash. But the monk would later tell the names to another novice. And that novice to another. And so on, down the long, dim hallway of years. And even as empires fell, and borders changed, and cathedrals turned to dust, somewhere, in a whisper, in a song, in a dream, the names remained. Not because they were remembered by the world, but because they were remembered by someone. And in that remembering, there was mercy. And in the mercy, there was peace.